Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be another one of the year-end videos that I am very behind on, so my apologies. I still have quite a number of them I'm trying to work into my schedule, but today I would like to talk about palette usage from last year, specifically my most used palettes. I'll be sharing with you all of the palettes I used 10 or more times. I have a collection of over 80 eyeshadow palettes, I believe, and I was shocked to see the number that I used 10 times or more. And we'll talk about some goals for 2024 at the end of today's video. But without further ado, I'm just going to hop right in to the palettes I used 10 times in 2023, and then we will work our way up to the palette I used the most. So I actually have 5 palettes I used only 10 times in, I was gonna say the month of January, absolutely not, in all of last year. And most of these palettes, if you've been watching my channel for a year, are going to be very familiar to you because these have been in project pans. So first up I have my Nomad Whistler Snow Lodge palette. This is my first and my only Nomad palette so far, but it is a brand I would like to get more palettes from in the future. I bought this one because Whistler is in Canada and I am Canadian, so I felt like this was the palette I needed to have from the brand. I really love this palette. There's only really one shade I'm not the biggest fan of, and that's Berry Cool, and that's simply preference, because of preference, not due to quality. But Powder Specialist and Ski Bum are really shifty and beautiful. Backcomb is too, but it's quite a bit darker, so I don't get as much use out of that shade. But I have gotten use out of every single shade in this palette. I've used this palette more than 10 times since I've owned it, but I did use it 10 times last year, and I should pull this out and get more use out of it while we're still in the winter months this year. I used my ABH Norvina Volume 3 palette 10 times. The quality on this palette is really great, but I don't find myself reaching for it a ton, only when it is rolled into project pans. But I did have a lot of fun playing with this in the spring especially. These shadows are really large and firmly pressed. They have 1.8 grams in each, so even though I used this 10 times, there are no dips, there's hardly a disturbance in any of the eyeshadows, so this is not one that I will probably ever have an eyeshadow pan in. I used the Alter Ego Goddess palette 10 times as well. I am an affiliate for Alter Ego. You can use my code emilynmax to save money. However, I did purchase this palette myself. It is inspired by the Natasha Denona Gold palette, and I really love this. This seems like one of those staple palettes in my collection. I was surprised I only used it 10 times last year because I really love it, especially the matte browns. They appear to be the most boring part of this palette, but I truly get so much use out of them. I do not like the shade Artemis, this shimmer teal shade, and I actually do like teal eyeshadow. I really like the matte, but this has a bit of like a muddy gray base to it, and I just can never get it to look super great on my eyes. I really like this one. Another older favorite is the Kidos Club Nebula palette. I can't believe it's been like many years since this palette has launched. This is one, I don't know if it would be like my introduction to indie shadows, but this palette represents a shift in my makeup usage or makeup preferences, I guess, because it is my first experience with multi-chromes or like really shifty duochromes. I'd only had like mild shifting duochromes or like a blue-brown shade, which used to be all the rage, but this has multi-chromes in it, and I really admire Angelica Nyqvist, and this palette, when it launched, I knew I had to have it, and I felt so creatively inspired by this palette. I really enjoyed the quality in here as well. I had no issues with any of the shades. I completely forgot that I had used my Colourpop So Jaded palette 10 times. This is why I'm so grateful to be tracking my makeup in the way that I do. I also saw there were so many palettes I neglected last year. Even though I felt like I did a better job at rotating, there were so many palettes I used last year, only once or twice. So this list is not very big, FYI. But I did use my Colourpop So Jaded palette 10 times last year. This is like an underrated favorite in my collection, or maybe I should say it's been like dethroned. Every time I use this palette, I'm reminded that I love it, but because it is so large, I just never think to randomly pull it out to just create a look. But maybe later this year it can find its way into a project pan once again, because it definitely needs more love from me. There are two palettes I used 11 times. The first is another Alter Ego palette. This is the Luster Charm, which is inspired by the Pat McGrath Divine Rose palette. I really like this. It's so unassuming in the palette, and that's how I feel about the Pat McGrath one as well. I have no strong desire to spend well over $100 on a Pat McGrath palette, so that's why I love Alter Ego, because their formula is really amazing. I enjoy it a lot, and I get to have the color stories from palettes that I can't afford, and this surprised me by how much I love it. I like the selection of colors. I do get a little tripped up because it's kind of a mix of cooler mauve tones and warmer. Like these are very warm toned specifically. This Shifty Crystal shade is like white to pink, and this is more of like a hot pink to gold situation. I don't know if you can see these shifts, but I really do like this palette a lot, and I used it 11 times. I also used my Odins Eye Norns palette 11 times in 2023, and this is still currently in my rotation. I have it in Project 10 Uses right now, and I've been getting quite a lot of use out of this winter, as well as last winter and at the very end of last year. This palette just surprises me and is much more versatile than I thought it was when I first bought it. I took a picture of all my Odins Eye palettes because I have 6 now, and this is the only one that has circle pans, and that kind of drives me nuts, but I really don't need to purchase the newer formatting because I think that the formula is the same. I could be wrong though, but I like this formula just fine. Again, there are no dips in this palette, even though I've used it quite a lot. I feel like my palettes don't look as beat up and loved as I want them to. Next, I used my ABH Jackie Ina palette 12 times. I was trying to remember, in 2023, and I'm pretty sure that Trust Issues was my very first eyeshadow pan of last year as well. This was it in No Pan Left Behind last year? And so I got used to everything. There are some dips forming in some of the other shades. I really love this palette, and I would love for it to have more pans before it actually starts, like the quality starts declining on it. I love Lituation, Sponsored, Credit. There's so many good shades in here. Now opening up all these palettes, I just want to like create looks with all of them again. I used my Natasha Denona Zeno palette 18 times last year, and I really struggled with this palette in my whole collection Project Pan 2023. The shade Vigor was randomly generated to put into that project, the matte red, and I really don't prefer that shade. It's probably my least favorite shade in this entire palette. I found it a bit tricky to work with, but I aimed to use many of the other shades. I don't know for sure if I did No Pan Left Behind because I'm not tracking my palettes in that way unless it's in that specific project, but I definitely, like, I used the greens and blues, I used a lot of these warm shadows, and tried to get use on the palette as a whole, not just this one shade, which is something I've continued to do and has made doing my eyeshadow so much more enjoyable for me. The main reason projects like Pan Those Eyeshadows doesn't work for me, beyond me being light-handed, is I really hate creating my look with 6 palettes open, especially if I'm reaching for a similar shade. So for example, if I were using this palette, I had the matte red, but then I had a gold shade in another palette. It just drives me nuts to go find and open another palette for a gold shimmer when I could just use the one that is right here in front of me. Anyways, this is not my favorite. It was a lovely, thoughtful gift from my husband for our 10-year anniversary a couple of years ago. That was like when this launched. And so I don't want to get rid of it, but Natasha Denona is just not my favorite, you guys. I truly love my mini nude palette, but my other palettes from her, I used my Colourpop Wild Nothing palette 20 times in 2023, and that was again because it got rolled into my whole collection project pan. Again, I was focusing on top down here, which I was able to set my crease with, but similarly to the other palettes, I used a variety of the shades. I actually have a very big dip in Spirited here, and I wonder if I could hit pan in that this year. It's more of a Super Shock consistency, so it does move around quite a lot. I really enjoy this for my fair skin. I like the rosy undertones of the shadows, and I'm happy I got quite a lot of use on this one. I'm so happy that my Hella palette got so much use from me in 2023. This is my favorite palette of 2022, so I used it a lot the previous year, and it is currently in my project level up, so it is still getting so much love. I used this palette 23 times in 2023, which has a nice ring to it, and I did so many looks with this palette, not just focusing in on one shade. I love this palette so much. Once again, I feel creatively inspired looking in here. I think Angelica Nyqvist just does amazing color stories. This palette continues to be a favorite. And lastly, the 12th palette. Yes, there's only 12 palettes in my collection that I used 10 times or more, and I'm sure you can guess what my most used palette of last year was. It was the Tarte Tartelette Toasted palette. I had this in my deck of panning project in it for the long haul, and I worked really hard to hit 2 pans in here. I am not the most proficient eyeshadow panner person, and it took me a really long time. I used this palette 64 times in 2023, which just sounds crazy to me. I did hit pan in Warmth and Cozy last year, and I haven't shown this anywhere except for Instagram, but earlier this year I did hit pan in S'more as well. So this palette now has 3 pans showing, and I believe it is now officially my most used palette in my entire collection. I have surpassed 120 uses on this, I think, and surprisingly, besides the 3 pans of shadow that actually have pan showing, I don't really have dips in the other shades, despite them getting quite a lot of use from me. Obviously not the same focus that the ones I was trying to hit pan on got, but I think it's going to take like another 50 uses to have another pan in here, which is absolutely crazy. So those were the 12 palettes in my collection that I used 10 or more times in 2023. I want double that. I would love to have 24 palettes in 2024 that I use 10 or more times. We'll just have to see. I do have a focus on testing and rotating through my palettes a bit more this year. I'm starting off the year with no pan left behind, which definitely helps. And if I have this lingering in the back of my mind, if come November, December, I have a lot of palettes that have 7, 8, 9 uses, I can reach for them just a handful more times to surpass this threshold. I will say I used more palettes than usual, at least 1, 2, 3 times in my collection, but that doesn't really seem that substantial, even though I know I have over 80 palettes and I can't use all of them 10 times each. Like, there's just not enough days in a year, and for how I personally like to do my makeup. but I do want that number to be much higher this coming year. So hopefully I can remember to do this video again. If you have a large eyeshadow collection like I do you think that you're using your palettes 10 or more times in a year? I think it was a really interesting exercise for me to look at my makeup tracking, or even just think about the palettes that I used throughout the year and reached for time and time again. I think all of these were in project pans. None of them were reached for over 10 times organically, whereas the palettes I used 1, 2, 3-ish times are the palettes I was reaching for organically. I just find it really interesting to look at my makeup usage data and kind of like rearrange things and look at things in new ways, and it reminds me to continue to use the collection I have and that I don't always need to be buying. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up so that I know, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!